Welcome to the first lecture with the name The Goat Problem in Goat format. This is about the Monty Hall problem, also known as Goat Problem. The name coincidentally fits quite well to the Goat format, and you can apply it here. Let's take a look at it. This is a replay, post side, Game 2 against Burn. I played a Chaos Turbo deck and sided in a Warrior side with Mystical Swordsman level 2, which performs quite well against Burn because he can kill Jars and Pandas under level limit and Gravity Bind. But that's not what it's about today. Let's take a look at the replay. I start with a very good starting hand against Burn, including some powerful cards and also graceful. Even if my hand is quite decent, you don't really need to wait with the grace until something like your Thunder Dragons. If you're playing against Burn, then you just want to activate it greedily. Card advantage doesn't really matter anyway. And even if we draw a Thunder Dragon by it, we still have a Raigeki break, so we can still use the Thunder Dragon even if we can't discard it with Graceful. It's not really a problem. That's why we will activate it turn 1. Anyway, the game starts with the opponent setting a Secret Barrel and Ojama Trio, but we'll focus primarily on our own plays here. Draw a Mystical Swordsman level 2 for turn. Theoretically, you can attack with it, but it's a bit wasted if he plays a Breaker or kills it with Trunade and Panda or something like that. Instead, we want to speed up as much as possible and just fire our Graceful Charity. Here it makes sense to discard a Dark right away. That will be important later for our Chaos plays. We discard a Sakuret armor, which looks harmless at first glance, but makes sense because we still have a Mirror Force on hand. But we'll talk about that later in the video. Why it's so interesting that we discarded the Saku here, especially for our opponent. He should be a bit worried at this point and make some notice. Of course, we play a Moef first. We want to see more cards and just speed up. We discard a Thunder Dragon and just set our back row. Let's see what he does. Apparently, nothing special. He sets a Sangan. Now we draw the Breaker. Very good in any case, but we want to keep it for later when he has non-chainables. First, we get the Graceful back, of course before anything else, just in case he plays a TT or something like that. I find that spot quite interesting here. Of course, you can just play the Mystical Swordsman level 2 and attack. He probably can't do anything against that. And even if we still have the BLS, which we can play in the main phase too. I decide to play a different line here, because with the Mystical Swordsman level 2, we have 2 monsters on the field. If he has an Ojama Trio, we are locked. So I play the BLS greedily. We want to have BLS or any Chaos monster as early as possible on the field, so that we can banish an Ojama and not get into the lock. Usually, you just play a Chaos monster as soon as you can use it. Here we banish the Sangan. Now I'm surprised that he hasn't activated the Ojama yet, because we could just set another card like Moef. Maybe because he thinks we can banish the token with BLS next turn. We tribute it for Thunder Dragon to attack. It might be a bit questionable. We could also set the TD in main too, or even tribute BLS, which sounds crazy, but could be valid. Anyway, I decided to get rid of the Moef to reduce cards in play and on field, and having no monster with 300 attack on the field that he can attack for damage. That's why we did this. You can activate the Graceful again. On the other hand, there are no cards we want to see right now, but that's not really a good argument as explained earlier. But with the BLS in play, his next turn could produce more action. That's why we waited and wanted to see what happens. He starts his turn with activating his own Graceful. He discards 2. After a Graceful, he should have a decent hand, so I do not think his Trunade that he plays immediately now is a bait. Now comes a play that is also interesting. We activate a Raigeki break to our BLS. We are extremely afraid of Snatch Steal at this point. Because if he has it, we basically lost the game. If we get 4,400 damage plus a Lily or some other beater he has in his hand, we would be basically dead. Because we don't want to lose the game, we activate Raigeki break on our own BLS, with the idea that we still have a strong hand with our own Graceful, the Mystical Swordsman level 2, and our Breaker. In conclusion, we think we are still strong in this spot. Even if we activate Raigeki break on our own BLS for -1 million, even then, we likely still win the game. If we had a weaker hand, so not the Breaker, not the Swordsman, and not the Graceful, but instead some bricks, then we probably wouldn't do that now. so I think this play is fine. He also activates Ojama and Barrel. Okay, we get a little damage. So what is he doing next? Yes, exactly, I would have done that too. He crushes with the rat and then searches for a panda. That means our BLS would have been dead anyway. In fact, we would have gotten a little less damage and would have had the Raigeki break. So it would have been much better. But if we think we can still win, it's worth playing around the snatch. In our next turn, we draw and play the breaker first, to not get more damage through the chain energy. We play the graceful now, but unfortunately did not find a direct out to the panda like a Chaos Sork. We discard the duo because he has one single card in hand. It's not worth it now for 1000 LP. And here you can also discard the Knight Assailant, then he would have a dark monster in the graveyard for the Sork. But the Knight Assailant is actually a good monster against burn. And we already have an MOF on hand, so why would we need a second one from the graveyard? Also, we want to get rid of cards if he has another barrels or something, so we just discard the MOF because we don't need it. We still have a heavy storm on hand and no real spells other than graceful in the grave anyway. And we actually have all the cards we need. We already have the storm in hand and do not need to recycle graceful to draw anything. That's why we discard MOF here. Unfortunately, we can't do anything against the panda. Of course, we could play a Knight Assailant, but it would also spam our field. We also do not really need to the NA to out a set monster, because we have the Swordsman. So our hope is just to put everything on the Mirror Force, and we just speculate that he will attack with the panda into it. He thinks about it a bit. He looks at our graveyard. Okay, we have a Saku. Mirror Force is still in, and he decides to attack. He runs into the Mirror Force, and that's how he loses the game. I already wrote in the chat that it was obvious that I had Mirror Force. We'll go into that later. He writes, okay, Saku versus Mirror Force is 2-1. That means there are 2 Sakus in my deck and a Mirror Force. So from his perspective, it was only a 1/3 probability that there is a Mirror Force. That's his way of thinking. But we'll see in a moment that he is wrong with that thought. And we'll find out what exactly the probability was, and whether it was a good play by him or not. Because in fact, I only sided 2 Sakus into burn. Of course he doesn't know that, but that can be a reasonable assumption. Because you don't necessarily want to have too many battle traps against burn, because you just have better cards. So we just have Knight Assailants, Raigeki breaks, also TT, and just a bunch of cards that are better monster outs than battle traps. In conclusion, we don't necessarily need 3 Sakus, because in many cases there are giant Trunades anyway to secure their plays. There are just not so many Sakus needed. So the assumption that we have 2 Sakus in the deck after siding is actually more reasonable. Then you might think, okay, 1 Saku's out there, so it's still Mirror Force or Saku. Then it's 50-50, isn't it? But that's also wrong. The probability that we have a Mirror Force here is, so to speak, 2/3 or 66%. We'll think about that again in a moment, after we've watched the replay to the end. At this point, I'm thinking about whether I can still play around some cards. But after I played the Storm, I realized, okay, Panda is game anyway. The Deserts is also game anyway. So I just have to hope that he draws a monster or a brick. That's why I decide to attack now. Then set Knight Assailant, pass, and then hope that he's dead next turn. It also happened by chance, and we won the game. GG. The interesting thing was really this one spot with the Mirror Force. Actually, there were 2 key moments in this duel associated with the Mirror Force. The first moment was when I discarded the Saku, and then the moment where he attacks into the Mirror Force. That was a big mistake that the opponent made here, in my opinion. Let's take a look at this more deeply again. That was my starting hand, and I activate a Graceful and discard 2 cards. A Dekoichi is not that special, but now I discard a Sakuretsu. And what does that mean? If I discard a Sakuretsu in this spot, and then set 2 cards, it won't be 2 Jars of Greed, not even Ring or a bait. There's a vulnerable MF that he later sees, which I do not wanted to set without battle protection. Of course, I want to have something against a panda attack, so that I do not take the free battle damage. That's actually the worst thing that can happen to you against a burn player, that the opponent attacks you directly, or with piercing damage. Play a panda and just attack. or let's say play Nobleman or Mind Control, and just attack with Giant Rat or Lily, and I take free battle damage. Just like that. I call it free because for battle damage, he does not need to waste a card. It's just damage without losing card advantage. That's how Burn easily wins. And you're almost dead if Lily comes through only once. You always want to have at least one battle trap. Even if he sends my battle trap back with a Trunade, then at least he must waste a card there, and also I can set it back again. And he needs to play another Trunade again, and needs to waste more. In conclusion, I would only discard this Sakuretsu if I had another battle trap like another Saku or Mirror Force. Not even if I had a Raigeki break, I would discard Saku at this point. Never, because I want to use my Raigeki break on a set monster. It's extremely important to out a Morphing Jar, Cyber Jar, or stuff like that. That means there are actually only 3 ways or possible worlds to discard this Sakuretsu. Either I have 2 Sakuretsus in my hand, or I have Sakuretsu and an additional Mirror Force in my hand. I sketched it here. Let's see. Luckily it's still there. Yeah, good. What we can conclude are essentially these cases. Because I have 2 Sakuretsu in my deck, I numbered them. Let's call them Sakuretsu number 1 and Sakuretsu number 2. You can imagine that as different copies for visualization purpose. Imagine one being super rare and one being common. These are all the cases that exist. I have also put the 2 cases here in which I only have one single Sakuretsu in my starting hand. Let's say only Sakuretsu number 1, but this is no possible world, because in this case I would not have discarded as I explained before. In this world where I only have Sakuretsu number 2 in my hand, but no other battle trap. This is also not possible because it's the similar case. So essentially, there are only these 3 cases left in a world where I discard a Sakuretsu by my grace. I have 2 Sakuretsus in my hand. That's this case. I have Sakuretsu number 2 in my hand and Mirror Force, or I have Sakuretsu number 1 in my hand and Mirror Force. Why I looked at these 2 cases separately with Sakuretsu num 1 and Sakuretsu number 2. Why did I told you should imagine this as different cases? Because each of the 3 cases is equally likely, but there are 2 combos, or worlds, in which I only have a single Saku, because there are 2 different cases. So the probability that I had a single Sakuretsu and the force in my hand was 2/3. And that I had 2 copies of Sakuretsu in my hand was 1/3, because it's only one case. And that's essentially it. If you think about it now, those were the probabilities. And they never changed. That's what the Monty Hall problem is all about. So the probability that the second card I had in my hand was a Sakuretsu is only one of 3 cases. Is this case? He hoped for this one, but was wrong. Because living in this world is only 1/3 probability. And the 2 remain cases with the Mirror Force that are good for me. Those were these 2 worlds we can still live in. 2/3 probability that I have only the single Saku in my hand, and these probabilities never changed because no play has been done that could have distinguished or eliminated any of the 3 cases. It was just 2/3 probability that I had a Mirror Force left in my hand, only 1/3 probability that the remaining battle trap was a Sakuretsu. It's as simple as that. This is the Monty Hall problem. You can translate it exactly like this, but I don't want to go into details here. If you don't know the Monty Hall problem, also known as the goat problem, I'm not joking, it's really about goats. Or if you didn't understand this probability calculation, or if you think it was 50-50 for you, because either it's force or not, and that every 2 possibilities are just 50-50, like the way the opponent was thinking about this, then you should definitely take a look at this, because that's exactly it. It's very confusing, and there are people that just don't get it and think it's 50-50 all day long. There are Wikipedia articles, there are also YouTube videos. I would recommend them to everyone. That's it. With the video for today, exactly. The bottom line is, you should be aware of which cards the opponent probably has. If he discards certain cards, that gives you information about other cards he might have, and be aware what the probabilities look like. In fact, they can look very different in different scenarios. If I don't have any hand cards, and I draw a card from the top, and I set it, the probability that it's a Mirror Force, it could be 1 to 20, in a scenario where I have like 20 spell or trap cards left in the deck. But if I had a card on the starting hand, and there is certain information about the starting hand, and information is provided by the fact that I discard certain cards, and I would not discard certain cards in other scenarios. There are very different probabilities, and these are all so-called conditional probabilities. You should be aware of this. Especially in this spot, it was a pretty pointless play by him. In this situation, it would probably have been the best play to not to attack at all, and just to stall a bit, because it would just slow down the game. This would be pretty safe, because last round I didn't put any monster on the field and could not out the panda. He should notice that I am kinda locked right now. I just set a back row. The probability that I won't do anything in the next turn is relatively high, because my hand apparently has no answers on the panda. I also apparently don't have any monsters on my hand. I do have a knight assailant, but he doesn't know that. So if he plays the lily and just walls with it, I probably cannot do anything, and he is pretty safe. I only have 3,400 life points. He can just wait a bit. He still has a secret barrel. He can draw a few burn cards and maybe win the game. Well, that's it for today. Ciao.